Good morning. Today we are going to learn some more about chapter 15, the boom or the bust. Yesterday we started learning about what was happening during the 20s and 30s, and we're going to go a little more in depth today. Remember those key terms we talked about yesterday. We have the stock, which is a share of ownership in a company that can be bought and sold, and the stock market is the place where people buy and sell those stocks. We kind of touched on how the Great Depression started with the crash of the stock market in 1929. Big crash because people got panicked because we know there's the ebb and flow with deflation and inflation, and people got scared. Stock prices are dropping. We have to sell it all. And so that panic caused the stock market to crash. Instead of realizing that, hey, things go down, they come back up. So instead of just being patient and waiting it out for the stock prices to go back up, they sold everything, and it caused a huge depression for over 10 years. That Great Depression lasted all of the 1930s. From 1920 to 1933, we were also in the time of Prohibition. So we're going to learn a little more about that and things that happened because of Prohibition, where alcohol was illegal. During the Depression, there were a lot of foreclosures, which was losing your property because you couldn't make payments on it. So you pay the bank, usually it's a bank, you pay them your monthly rent, your monthly mortgage payment, the monthly fees that you owe them, but if you can't make the payments, then they take it back and you lose it completely. A lot of people went on welfare during the Depression, so they were getting aid from the government. And then Franklin Roosevelt, the president at the time, developed the New Deal with all the new programs to help bring us out of the Depression. So today, we're moving on to before the crash, the Jazz Age. So let's look at page 317. We have a lot we're going to read today because tomorrow is an art day, so we are not going to be doing social studies tomorrow. So a lot of reading is going to happen today, so that means a lot of questions to be answered on your chapter comprehension, but you can work on it tomorrow during all of that homeroom time that we have on art days. So page 317, before the crash, the Jazz Age. Carl Warmington was 10 years old and living in Minneapolis when he first heard the new music that everyone seemed to be listening to after World War I. This uniquely American music was fast, happy, and fun. It came out of African American neighborhoods in New Orleans, Louisiana, and St. Louis, Missouri, and spread across the nation over the radio and on phonographs. People called the music jazz, and then they referred to the 1920s as the Jazz Age. And if you listen to jazz music, it is really upbeat, and it just kind of makes you smile because it's just fun music to listen to. As Warmington grew older, he spent hours and hours playing jazz records on his family's phonograph. Warmington wasn't satisfied just listening to jazz, he wanted to play jazz. He started taking trumpet lessons. Soon, he was playing in amateur bands around the Twin Cities. In 1923, at the age of 15, Warmington joined a 10-piece youth orchestra that performed in theaters all over Minnesota. A few years later, he picked up the trombone. By the time he was attending the University of Minnesota, Warmington was earning good money as a trombonist in several dance bands. So if we look at the pictures, Carl Warmington played in the jazz band at Breezy Point Lodge in the summers of 1929 and 1930. He is third from left in this photograph. And dancers gathered in 1925 at a Minneapolis dance hall to learn the latest jazz moves. Women were called flappers when they cut their hair short and wore clothes like these. So there was lots of beads, lots of dangly stuff on their dresses. So when they danced, it moved a lot. They had the short haircut, and they did some fun dances to watch. I've seen movies where they were dancing to the 1920s dances, and they're just fun. As he toured the theaters, resorts, and roadhouses of Minnesota, Warmington soaked up the giddy excitement of the Jazz Age. The country was at peace. Investors were getting rich in the stock market. Warmington noticed that attitudes were changing in this new era of jazz. So people were just so happy. There was no more war, so everybody was home and safe. People were making money on the stock market. We had this fun, upbeat music, and it was just a really happy time. Lifestyle changes during the Jazz Age. One place jazz was played was in illegal bars called speakeasies. The bars were illegal because of prohibition. This period was the result of a constitutional amendment that prohibited or banned making and selling alcohol. In speakeasies, however, people drank and danced. Liquor was supplied in the speakeasies by bootleggers, people who made and sold illegal or bootleg alcohol. Yesterday, somebody brought up moonshine. So that would fall under this. Moonshine is the whiskey that people make in their own houses. Okay, so moonshine became popular during this time.
They usually would make it in the woods.
A lot of times, yeah. Colin?
I saw a musical recently that was called Moonshine Abbey.
Oh.
And it was taking place.
Was it taking place in the 1920s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were like monks that were.
Yep, well, there were a lot of people that got in on making the alcohol. Let's see. New intimate dancing styles such as the bunny hug were introduced. Warmington later recalled, speakeasies and bootleggers became popular, and parties stimulated by illegal liquor took on more gaiety, so it was a lot of happiness. Jazz music fit nicely into this new mood. Women contributed to this new mood too. Some of the changes for women during this time were obvious to Warmington. Many women were cutting their long hair short and wearing new clothing styles. Shorter dresses with loose waistlines replaced floor-length skirts and dresses that were tight around the waist. So this way they could do all the dance moves and they could move around on the dance floor with ease. Because when you're wearing something that's floor length, you're going to trip on it if you're trying to dance around. And having it loose around the waist means you could move a lot more. So the new clothing styles kind of fit the new dances that they were doing. Lifestyle changes not related to appearance were even more important. More women than ever before were attending college, taking office clerical jobs, driving automobiles, and voting in elections. All roles previously reserved for men. Remember, wasn't it 1923 when women got the right to vote? 1919 was for Minnesota, right? So 1923 is when African Americans or Native Americans were allowed to vote. 1920 is when women got the right to vote. So they were taking more active role in society. A stronger sense of independence characterized women of the Jazz Age. In the summer of 1929, Carl Warmington played with a dance orchestra at the Breezy Point Lodge on Big Pelican Lake, not far from the town of Pequot Lakes. The lodge was a speakeasy that served illegal liquor and had an illegal gambling casino. Breezy Point was a popular destination among gangsters and Hollywood movie stars. That's where they would go to vacation. So who knows, maybe some of the Gambinos came out here.
No.
Mm-hmm. Guests arrived in fancy cars and wore fancy clothes. Warmington did not make much money at the lodge, but he enjoyed hanging out with the people who seemed to have more money than they could spend. The summer went quickly. In August, Warmington returned to the Twin Cities to continue college. For 2 months, 2 months later, the stock market crashed. Warmington, like many Minnesotans, did not worry very much at first about the effects of the crash. During the months that followed, he finished his college education and made plans for the coming summer. President Herbert Hoover gave me encouragement when he said that business was sound and the economy would improve, he recalled. So I signed on for another season at Breezy Point Lodge. Was it going to recover soon? No. People thought, oh, it's okay. Stock market crash, but we'll be fine. life will go on like normal. They didn't realize just how bad it was going to get. The summer of 1930 was Carl Warmington's last carefree summer for a very long time. Like many Minnesotans, he was about to discover that the exciting days of the Jazz Age were over. So if he's going back to the resort, are there going to be lots of people coming to the resort in 1930? Why not, Peyton?
Because they had no more money.
Yeah, they lost all their money. So all these gangsters and the Hollywood movie stars who had all this money, all of a sudden lost their money. They weren't getting that income. They didn't have the stock market. So they're not going to be able to take the vacations and have that party lifestyle anymore. Prohibition. In 1919, the U.S. Constitution was amended to ban the sale of liquor. This ban was called Prohibition because it prohibited liquor, and it went into effect in 1920. The law that officially made liquor sales illegal was called the Volstead Act. It was named after Andrew Volstead, a Minnesota congressman who led the committee that wrote the law. The Prohibition supporters, such as members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, believed it would reduce drunkenness. They hoped Prohibition would make the nation a better and safer place. It did not. So what they had planned for is not what came to be. They had this idea in their head that, if we just get rid of alcohol, people will make better choices. But instead, people found ways to make worse choices and do illegal things because they didn't want to be told what they can and cannot drink. If anything, Prohibition made drinking alcohol more fashionable. Illegal saloons called speakeasies opened up in nearly every city. Gangsters moved in to control the supply of bootleg or illegal liquor. Minnesota was a perfect location for bootleggers. They smuggled or snuck liquor into Minnesota from Canada and sent it by train to St. Paul. Police raids like the one pictured here did little to control illegal liquor. Profits from this illegal activity turned several small-time bootleggers in St. Paul into powerful criminal bosses. They bribed city officials and police officers to protect their illegal bootleg business. Well-known gangsters like George Machine Gun Kelly Barnes and John Dillinger hid out in St. Paul because they knew they would be safe. Gangster Alvin Creepy Karpus put it this way: of all the Midwest cities, the one that I knew best was St. Paul, and it was a crook's haven. Every criminal of any importance in the 1930s made his home at one time or another in St. Paul. If you were looking for a guy you hadn't seen for a few months, you usually thought of two places: prison or St. Paul. If he wasn't locked up in one, he was probably hanging out in the other. So they even have tours in St. Paul where you can see some of the hideouts and some of the tunnels that the gangsters would use. So yeah, there's the St. Paul tunnels. I haven't gone on the tour. We had planned on going on it, and then COVID hit, and then we just never got around to doing it. But my understanding is they're pretty cool to go on these tours, and you can kind of see what is left of what the gangsters would do. Yes, Paul.
You're saying that in the Jazz Age there was a lot of crime and stuff?
Yes. Yes, lots of crime during the Jazz Age because it was the time of Prohibition, and people still wanted to have their alcohol even though it was illegal. So crime was kind of booming, especially here in St. Paul. It was a hideout for a lot of criminals. They would get in trouble in Chicago, or maybe they just need a vacation time. They would come to St. Paul. So there was a lot of mafia happening in St. Paul. Yes.
I have a question. How did they why and how did they use the tunnels?
Well, when you're doing illegal stuff, you can't just be carrying your keg of whatever alcohol you have down the street, right? So they use tunnels and they use the caves to hide stuff and to get around from place to place.
Like the sewer tunnels, like this. What do you think?
Well, I didn't say sewer. I said tunnels. Tunnels aren't sewers. They're different. By the 1930s, most Americans believed that prohibition was a mistake because it wasn't doing what it was set up to do. It was supposed to make it a better, safer place with less crime, and instead there was more crime. So it wasn't solving the problem, it was making it worse. Drinking was still common, and crime had increased because of illegal liquor sales. In 1933, the nation changed the Constitution again, this time to get rid of prohibition. The bootleggers were now out of business. St. Paul's gangster era soon came to an end. Now they didn't have that way to make money. So the gangsters now are going broke not because of the stock market crash, but because there's no prohibition. So they don't have that easy way to make their money. So there's going to be problems from that. Lots of problems happening in the 30s. Before the crash, remember when I said that the roaring 20s were a great time for a lot of people, not for everyone. So before the stock market crash, there was a farm crisis going on. Colin?
Was this stuff happening in like all of the states?
A prohibition? Yes.
The stock market crashing.
Yes, that affected the entire United States. So the stock market crash affected everyone. The prohibition affected everyone. They had speakeasies and illegal bootlegging going on all over the country. But because this is a Minnesota history class, we're just focusing on Minnesota during that time period. But yes, it affected everyone. The 1920s had been good years for many city dwellers, but they were hard years for the people of Minnesota's small towns and farms. Rural Minnesota's problems had started shortly after World War I ended. During the war, the government had encouraged farmers to produce more food to keep American and British soldiers and civilians from going hungry. After the war, farmers continued to produce the same amount. So they're producing more food, even though the demand for their goods decreased. As a result, prices for farm products dropped dramatically. Supply and demand. There was less demand for the products, so the prices dropped. So they were still producing more and more because they're used to feeding the soldiers, but now the government's not buying the food for the soldiers. So they have all this surplus food, and now they don't have a way to pay for it. By 1922, farmers earned less than half the income they had received 3 years earlier for their wheat and corn. The prices they got for their pigs and beef cows were not much better. Farmers who owed money on their farms found it increasingly difficult to repay their debts. More and more of them went bankrupt or broke. The people of Otter Tail County were among thousands of Minnesotans who felt the sting of the 1920s farm crisis. Otter Tail County's economy depended heavily on farms, meat processing plants, and businesses that served farmers' needs. When farmers could no longer afford to buy what they'd bought previously, local businesses began to fail. Rural people in many jobs went further and further into debt as a result of the poor farm economy. In one way, Otter Tail County was better off than most rural areas in the state. Many farmers in Otter Tail County found a new agricultural product that allowed them to adapt to the hard times. After years of farming nothing but wheat, their soil had become less productive. And we talked about that, the reason why we need that crop rotation. So they had been so used to just farming wheat that the wheat's not going to be growing so well. Some farmers turned from growing wheat to milking cows. By the late 1920s, Otter Tail County was one of the state's top producers of dairy products, such as milk and cheese. Prices for dairy products in the 1920s did not drop as much as those for wheat, corn, pigs, and beef cows. Many Otter Tail County farmers did not suffer as much as other farmers in the state. So they were able to adapt and they were able to change to make it not be as hard on them. So they could still get the profit that they were trying to get. Not everybody had the ability to change over their farms, to produce different kinds of food, but Otter Tail County was able to. Farmers take action. During the Great Depression, the economy tightened its grip on the nation's farms. Prices for farm products dropped even lower than they had been in the 1920s. In 1932, many farmers in the upper Midwest decided to take action. They banded together to form a new organization called the Farmers Holiday Association. Sounds like they want to go on vacation. One of the group's main goals was to keep food from getting to market until prices rose. Association members refused to sell their own produce, and they set up roadblocks to keep other farmers from selling theirs. So they're saying, well, if there's less supply, there's going to be more demand. So if we stop all the food going to the market, then people are going to want that food even more because it's not there. They're going to be willing to pay more, so our prices will go back up. By keeping the supply of food low, association members helped force prices up. Association members also tried to stop banks from taking farms away from farmers. When farmers were unable to make payments on their bank loans, the banks would put the farms in foreclosure, ending the loan contract and claiming the property for the bank. Banks would then sell everything on these farms to cover the farmers' unpaid debts. The banks would have auctions, public sales at which each item from the farm was sold to the person who offered the highest bid. Sometimes association members helped each other by buying these items. They bid low, offering just pennies for each item. When the auction was over, banks gained only a few dollars. Association members then returned the items they had bought to the original owner. And I've heard about this, them doing this for the sale of the actual farm too. The farmers would all show up and they wouldn't let anybody outbid the person who had owned that farm. So maybe their farm was foreclosed on and they only have $10. So they bid $10 on the farm, and if nobody else bids, they win the auction. They win their farm back for just $10. And now they own it and they don't have to make payments on it anymore. So when they worked together, they were able to help one another out. But it hurt the banks. So the banks aren't making any money. The banks are losing money. Farmers wanted a law to stop foreclosures until times were better. In February of 1933, Governor Floyd Olson, shown here, declared a farm emergency and stopped all foreclosures in Minnesota. So they were able to see that, hey, foreclosing on all these farms isn't going to help anybody because nobody's going to be farming them. Okay, not every farm auction were they able to buy back their own farm. They had to band together and work to do that, but that couldn't happen all the time. So all these farms were being foreclosed on. Nobody's farming the farms. We're not getting the food that we need, and it helped that spiral. So they were stopping the foreclosures, just kind of like during COVID. They put a stop to people getting evicted from their apartments. So there was no eviction during COVID because so many people were out of work because of COVID. So the government can step in to help people out in a time of crisis. One family in Otter Tail County feels the sting. Conrad and Elizabeth Toso were among the many Otter Tail County farmers who made the switch to dairy farming. They lived with their 9 children in Maplewood, a heavily wooded township that was difficult to farm. Their farm was small, 40 acres. They could manage up to 10 milk cows. The Toso's small dairy operation did not produce much income, but it was enough to help the family get by. Like many Otter Tail County farmers, the Tosos largely fed themselves. They kept hogs, chickens, and had a vegetable garden. We never went hungry, Conrad recalled, but the table was always clean. The children ate what was on the table. So the table was always clean. That means they always ate everything. They didn't have leftovers. There wasn't extra food. They always ate everything that they had because they didn't have much. The children ate what was at the table, whether it was something they liked or not. That was the food to eat. That's what you ate. So they kind of get what you get and you don't throw a fit mentality. This is our food. This is dinner. Eat it or go hungry. The Tosos and most other Otter Tail County farmers managed to hold on to their farms through the years of the 1920s. Then the stock market crashed. A major economic depression set in. Hard times on Minnesota farms were far from over. After the crash, the job crisis. Back in the city, Carl Warmington got a rude surprise. It was the fall of 1930, a year after the crash. He had just finished his summer orchestra gig at the Breezy Point Lodge and was looking for a new job, but he could not find one. Not in Minneapolis, not anywhere. The economic crisis triggered by the stock market crash, the Great Depression, was spreading quickly through Minnesota and the rest of the nation. By the fall of 1930, private organizations such as the Salvation Army were struggling to provide welfare to a growing population of people without jobs and homes. So, Salvation Army started because of the Great Depression, still around today. So you'll see that Christmas time, the big red kettles, people raising money for Salvation Army. So it's still around trying to help people in need. Warmington thought his college degree would help him find a job, even in tough times. He was wrong. I looked in vain for any kind of full-time position, he recalled. I watched the want ads and filled out employment applications without a callback. Even though he had no job, Warmington still felt luckier than many people since he had a place to live with his parents. So a lot of people lost their homes. They were living in shelters or on the street. One day in December of 1930, he visited a friend's father. The man worked for a private organization that gave vouchers or tickets for meals and lodging to homeless men in Minneapolis. Years later, he described his impressions of what was called the soup line, where people could turn in a voucher to get a hot meal. And these soup lines, you can see pictures of them. These lines went all the way down the street of people waiting just to get a bowl of soup because they had no money, they had no food. They would wait in these big long lines just to get up to the front to get their bowl of soup. What a dark and dreary sight. It had begun to snow and the wind was howling down this deserted lane. Stretched along the side of an empty building was a long line of shivering men, many with only light jackets. Now remember, this is December. So people just have a light jacket. Think about what it's like in Minnesota in December. It is cold, and they only have light jackets on. The line reached down the alley to a fire escape that crawled up the side of this dark warehouse to the second floor. The only action from this long queue of men was from their stomping feet in the snow, trying to keep warm. So it was a really dark and dreary time. Few jobs, many people. Among the men and women who struggled were those who had worked farms, mined the iron range, logged the forest, labored in factories, or worked in offices. Now, some who had built up Minnesota's industries were jobless and waiting in line for a chance to eat a hot meal. Skilled workers fared better than unskilled ones, but people in every industry were hit hard. Frequently, African Americans and American Indians were the first to be laid off and the last to be hired during these tough economic times. Nearly half the African Americans in Minnesota in 1920 had been born in the South. Many had come north to escape discrimination and seek new opportunities. Although most found the situation in Minnesota an improvement, few were treated as equals by European Americans. So there was still discrimination up north here in Minnesota. Not as bad as it was in the South, but they were still the first ones to be fired from their jobs. There was still discrimination happening. For American Indians in Minnesota, the majority of whom lived on reservations, the Great Depression was a continuation of the hard times they had experienced for decades. During this time, men were generally considered the main breadwinners or economic providers for families. Women, who made up just over 20% of American workforce in 1930, often lost their jobs in favor of keeping men employed. So the women were the first ones to be fired. Women and minorities, because the men were the typical breadwinners, so the women were just extra money if they were working. So they thought we need to keep the men on because they're the ones who are really providing for the family at that time. Most women were married and most of their husbands were still employed, but their wages had been cut dramatically. Others had husbands who had lost their jobs altogether. Just as men did, women struggled to provide for themselves and their families during this economic crisis. A few years into the crisis, the wife of President Franklin D. Roosevelt wrote a book titled "It's Up to the Women." In it, Eleanor Roosevelt offered these words of praise and encouragement to women. The needs of life must be met, and it is women's courage and determination which time and again have pulled us through worse crises than the present one. A job for Carl Warmington. In early 1931, Carl Warmington finally landed an office job with the city of Minneapolis. Before long, he was transferred to the city's Department of Public Relief, the agency that helped people who needed housing, food, counseling, health care, and clothing. By this time, about 35,000 people in a workforce of 212,000, 1 in 6, had lost their jobs in Minnesota. Think about that. 1 in 6 people lost their job. That is a lot of people. Over the next few years, Warmington and his fellow relief workers tried hard to make life better for the thousands of Minneapolis residents who needed help. Still, there was only so much Warmington's office could do. The Great Depression was a national or federal crisis, not a city crisis. City funds were limited, Warmington recalled. It was not until federal funds were made available that improved care for homeless people was possible. Excuse me. A new president is elected. Who remembers who did I say was the president when the Great Depression happened? Nope. At the beginning of today, it was Herbert Hoover was president when the Great Depression first happened. So Herbert Hoover was the one who said, "Oh, it'll be okay. The economy's going to be just fine. Things will get back to normal." There was worse. So he was saying, "Oh, it's going to be fine," but it wasn't. Things got worse. So then Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets elected. In 1932, the American people elected a new president with a new vision. Franklin D. Roosevelt had won by promising a New Deal for the American people. His first challenge was to fight panic among Americans and restore their confidence in the country's economic system. Within his first 100 days in office, the federal government passed 15 bills to deal with the crisis. The executive and legislative branches of the government worked together to make this happen. President Roosevelt proposed each bill, Congress passed it, and then the president signed it into law. To gain support, the president took his ideas and his programs straight to the American people. He started a series of radio broadcasts called Fireside Chats, where he just talked to the American people, helped them get their confidence back in their country. Many Americans approved of Roosevelt's plans, which were called the New Deal. Those who did felt hope for the future now that the government was trying to relieve their misery. So we are going to learn more about the New Deal, what hope he was bringing, what kind of programs he started to help life get better. For my friends at home, we hope you are well, and we hope to see you soon.